Reading The Wasteland gave me a new outlook on art and abstractionism. The philosophical connotation and viewpoint on morality gave me a lot to think about. My notes are mostly full of allusions to these themes. I think the reason why the Quran, death, and water are the most prevalent words in my notes are because the reminder that we're all eventually gonna die. That's not to say the Quran reminds me that I'm going to die. It's just more of a reminder of our own mortality. I like the intersections between the Quran and Bible, most notably the tying together of Memento Mori and Surah 478. Even before the chapter Death by Water, it seemed like a theme, but once we read it, it seemed even more so. During that class, we mostly talked about death, but I think the aspect of water was important too. I probably thought of this because it's another story about the sea, but I remember comparing Death by Water to Moby Dick, and how Captain Ahab was consumed by his revenge for the whale and it ends up killing him. I think the water in Death by Water consumes Phlebas in a similar way. He's consumed by death, and at the end of the chapter, it has a line about being beautiful and tall, but still reminding you that you'll be consumed by death like everyone else. So I guess the perspective on mortality is what stood out to me most according to my notes. The less prevalent words are mostly just things Mr. Smith wrote on the board, but the observations I had about them mostly had to do with philosophy. One class we were talking about tragedy and comedy, and how tragedy depicts men as nobler than they are in real life, and comedy emphasizes human failings. We mentioned catharsis, rising and falling action, and it all really reminded me of Poetics by Aristotle. I don't think I said anything at the time because I didn't want to look stupid, but once I got home I checked my copy of Poetics, and in the notes section at the beginning of the book there was a quote from T.S. Eliot about it, so I guess it was more than coincidental that we talked about it all on the same day. When we started talking about the Bible, I noticed more similarities to ancient Greek philosophers. I once again didn't say anything because this is a pretty far-fetched idea, but basically my idea was that there were quite a few similarities between Socrates and Jesus. Like, they both had disciples, never wrote down anything, were charged for corrupting the youth, and were killed by the government for being annoying. Even during both their trials, they didn't argue against their punishment, and in Socrates' case, he basically told them that he should be given a reward for showing them the error of their ways. After he died, he was born again as Plato's mouthpiece, because anytime Plato wanted something to sound credible, he would just say that he and Socrates already had a discussion about it. Which also made me think that Peter in the Bible was kind of like Plato, because they both kind of just leave their friends to die, and only after Socrates' death, Plato wrote an apology letter to the government of Athens in his defense. And even after that, Plato founded his own school that Aristotle attended. Kind of like how Peter became the first pope. And all this happened 400 years before Jesus was even born. But speculations aside, I think philosophy did a lot of work filling in the background of my notes.
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
These themes mesh together to provide a disparate angle on the world of art. I decided to visit the Ammon Carter Museum of Art because they were doing an exhibit on Chicano protest art. I selected 3 specifically that I want to talk about: Sun Mad, Bee Pile, and La Ofrenda. I like Ester Hernandez's Sun Mad because it attempts to do something similar to traditional pop art but in a different way. Traditional pop art would seek to capture the virtue of art from icon imitation. Pop art satirizes art and iconography by lifting an ordinary icon into godhood, and maintaining a semi-seriousness that it is still art.
Andy, do you feel that the public has insulted your art?
No.
Why not?
Well, I hadn't thought about it.
It doesn't bother you at all, then?
No.
Well, do you think that they've shown a lack of appreciation for what pop art means?
No.
Andy, do you think that pop art has sort of reached the point where it's becoming repetitious now?
Yes.
Do you think it should break away from being pop art?
No.
Are you just going to carry on?
Yes.
Andy, a Canadian government spokesman said that your art could not be described as original sculpture. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Why do you agree?
Well, because it's not original.
You have just then copied a common item.
Yes.
Well, why have you bothered to do that? Why not create something new?
Because it's easier to do.
Well, isn't this sort of a joke, then, that you're playing on the public?
No. It gives me something to do.
It is tragedy to see heroes fail or villains seize the throne. And it is comedy to see heroes succeed and villains earn the justice they deserve. So here there is an aspect of comedy in tragedy. Seeing a bad or ordinary thing revered as art when we the audience know it is a gilded facade is tragic. But it's comedic because of the truth that the statue of worship is merely a parody, absurdly pretending to be virtuous when we, the audience, understand its true nature. Sunmad does the inverse to show tragedy and comedy. By portraying iconography plainly as what it is, it looks so much worse than the mask it normally wears. We, the audience, laugh at first because it's absurd to see. The tragedy is the truth that huge agribusiness corporations hide behind wholesome iconography while they poison the water of California's San Joaquin Valley, where Ester Hernandez drew inspiration for this piece.
You like jazz? I'm sorry.
B-Pile by Sonia Romero is another downer. But I like this piece anyway because of how it conveys so much through simplicity. An ordinary beehive is made of hundreds of workers who on their own would have no chance of survival. The bees work together and form a hive through what systems theory would call emergence. A beehive transcends the sum of its parts by creating complexity from simplicity, or by having many simple things, complexity emerges. I think the art almost performatively makes its statement in the same way. You would expect motion or complexity from so many bees, but the message it conveys is stillness. The performance is the lack thereof. Many simple, motionless things combine to create one complicated, motionless thing. And because of that, we can extract meaning out of it that wouldn't be there otherwise. Before I had even inspected the artwork, I knew what the subject matter was. If it had only been one or two bees, that meaning would be lost. I wanted to talk about the other piece that Ester Hernandez did, La Ofrenda, for a couple of reasons. The tattoo on her back is of the Virgin Mary, specifically a depiction of the Virgin Mary associated with the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City. The story behind it would one day canonize Saint Juan Diego. The story begins with Juan Diego receiving a vision from the Virgin Mary. She told him to get the bishop's approval to dedicate a shrine to her on Tepeyac Hill, but the bishop wanted proof of the vision, so when Juan Diego returned to the hill, he found blooming roses. This was strange because it was nearing winter, but he picked them and brought them to the bishop under his cloak. When he returned and opened his cloak, the roses spilled out, and behind them there was an image of the Virgin Mary. The bishop gave his blessing and the chapel was built where the cloak remains today. The image that was on the cloak is the same on the tattoo, and that's also why it's being offered a rose. But there's also a secondary meaning behind it. In 1991, it was published on the cover of Carla Trujillo's book, Chicano Lesbians, and has since been associated with the lesbian movement. I learned this from the tour guide, who was a nice old lady. After she mentioned the lesbian movement, however, she asked if anyone had any comments on the painting. She didn't ask for any of the other paintings, so I wondered why this painting was different. After about 2 seconds I realized, and I looked at everyone else in the tour. The tour was mostly old people and grandchildren except for a group of 2 adult women. I definitely wasn't going to say anything about it, so I hope the 2 women might. But they must have thought the same thing because I never got a follow-up. In conclusion, the Wasteland gave me some interesting insight that provided a new perspective for art appreciation. I think the philosophy undertones drew me in and allowed me to relate the text to different external sources. And the relating factor of religion and mortality provided many bridges of overlap as well.
You see Big Destiny anywhere?
Big D's chilling over here. Wasteland style.